All right, good evening, everyone. Oh, that's right. Hey, okay. My name is Enid Gonzalez-Orta. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Biological Sciences here, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the Fall 2018 STEM Scholars Lecture. Before I introduce our speaker today, I'd like to thank Capital Public Radio and the Office of Public Affairs at Sacramento State for their support. Tonight, I'm very excited to introduce to you my colleague, my collaborator, and my friend, Dr. Jamie Kneitel. Dr. Kneitel is a native of California and is a professor here in the Department of Biological Sciences, where he's been teaching since 2004. His research focuses on how environmental variation and disturbances affect biodiversity and ecosystem functioning of seasonal freshwater ecosystems. His research bridges ecological principles and conservation issues and has included projects using microbes, invertebrates, vertebrates, and plants. He has worked with the California vernal pool ecosystem for 10 years, and his research has been supported by a variety of state and federal agencies, including the National Science Foundation, the Department of Defense, the U.S. Forest Service, and the Bureau of Reclamation's U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. In 2017, Dr. Kneitel received the University Award for Research, Scholarship, and Creative Activity for senior faculty, and he has mentored over 70 graduate and undergraduate students. These have resulted in approximately 40 publications and over 90 presentations at conferences and universities. Prior to his time at Sacramento State, Dr. Kneitel was a Tyson postdoctoral fellow at Washington University in St. Louis after he completed a PhD at Florida State University. He received his master's degree from California State University, Northridge, and a bachelor's degree from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Most recently, he became a Fulbright Scholar and has recently returned from conducting research and teaching in Israel and Morocco. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kneitel tonight to his lecture, Here Today, Gone Tomorrow, A Global Perspective on Seasonal Wetlands.
Thank you, Enid. Wow, all right. We're all here, right? It's really, I want to thank Enid for introducing me, and I also want to thank Sharon Pericelli and the Success Center and the College of Natural Sciences and Math for inviting me. It's an incredible pleasure and honor, really, to speak to you this afternoon or this evening. And especially when there's so many other options out there, right? You could be at home checking out, Trump's Twitter feed for the day. I also saw that there's a down the hall, there is a comedy show going on. And so hopefully there's no one who came in here accidentally, because it's not going to be, there's no funny business here. And no heckling either. Tonight I'll be talking about, as Enid pointed out, the system I've been working in for a little over a decade now. And I want to point out that this title, the Here Today, Gone Tomorrow, is a double entendre. And it refers to it describes how these underappreciated and understudied ecosystems have been facing really great declines worldwide. But it also refers to their very nature and how dynamic they are and always changing. Now, most ecosystems are not like that. And I'm going to start off this talk with a picture of this fine gent, which is me, in the late 70s. And looking very happy right there. I think I was expecting to pull out a great white shark. But what I want you to focus in on is in the background, you have Lake Tahoe, and even further back, you have these forests up in the mountains of the Sierra Nevada. And there's a certain stability with these ecosystems, these large ecosystems of the world. And if I were to return to this dock a couple weeks later, all that would still be there. The lake, the forested areas in the background. Even if I returned several months later or the following year, those habitats would largely be there and similar species would be still found there. Even if we returned 40 years later to this location, we would see these habitats there. And people tend to be attracted to these large habitats, these stable habitats. And this is true for scientists as well. They like to study these large habitats. But of course, many habitats in the landscape are not permanent. And this is especially true in the drier parts of the world. And so imagine yourself in a particular location where parts of the year it looks like this. Well, if you're an aquatic organism, you're living life. You're doing your thing, hanging out. But other times of the year, it looks like this, where you have this terrestrial phase. And so if you're that aquatic organism, you're going to have adaptations or being able to survive the drying out or somehow adapted to through these periods of time. Similarly, if you're one of these terrestrial organisms, you too are going to have adaptations to survive or somehow tolerate the flooding periods of the year. So the systems I'm talking about today are freshwater ecosystems, and specifically we describe them as seasonal or ephemeral or temporary. Those all pretty much mean the same thing. And these are shallow, very small aquatic habitats. And that might be why they tend to be overlooked and less studied. And they all cycle through these phases where you have certain times of the year where they're aquatic and terrestrial, and then they return to being aquatic. And this cycle can occur once a year, it can occur several times within a year, or it could occur once every several years. We have a number of examples of these kinds of seasonal freshwater ecosystems in California. For example, intermittent streams or rivers, again, another word for just temporary. And you probably know places like this, right? Where certain times of the year, usually the winter, it looks like this, and much of the year kind of looks like that, dry cobblestones. Other examples include floodplains. They include meadows, such as this scene up in the Sierra Nevada. And the ecosystems that I work in, rock pools and vernal pools. But these kinds of systems, these wetland ecosystems that I'll be talking about, are found throughout the world. And depending on where you are in the world, they're called something different. So, if you were to go down to South America, you could go find the humidals or the vlaes of South Africa, or the dayas of North Africa and the Middle East. And these systems are going to vary slightly, but in general, they have these same properties of filling up and drying out on some annual basis or some period of time. Now, the type of seasonal wetlands that I work in, and I'll be mostly focusing on today, are Mediterranean temporary ponds. And the vernal pool enthusiasts will not like this, but I'm going to use seasonal wetlands and vernal pools and temporary ponds all interchangeably today, okay? And so the system that these Mediterranean temporary ponds, of course, are found in the Mediterranean regions of the world. And the reason I'm kind of using these terms interchangeably is I want to really highlight the ecology and the threats that are faced not only here in the seasonal wetlands found here, but also globally. So that's why I'm keeping it general. And I want you to leave tonight appreciating these spectacular and important ecosystems that we have in our backyard, but also appreciate that we also have this link with these other parts of the world, and that we can both contribute to and learn from. Okay, so the outline for my talk this evening is the following. We're going to take a step back, and I'm going to describe the general characteristics of Mediterranean climate regions. And then we're going to get a little bit more specific and talk about a little bit more specifically of seasonal wetlands and seasonal wetland ecology. And there I'll be using many examples from California vernal pools. And then I'll get even more specific and talk about my research and specifically the work that I've been a part of here in California, as well as Israel and Morocco. And some of these are projects that are linked, and some of these I'll use, I'll create bridges and parallels between these various projects done in these different locations. And then we'll have concluding remarks, of course. Okay, so taking our step back. So for many, many decades, ecologists and biogeographers have categorized the major communities of the world based on their vegetation. And these categories are called biomes, and up there. And it's based on the vegetation, and whoa, anybody hurt? Okay, all right. And so it's based on the vegetation and the adaptations that that vegetation has in a particular area. So we could go to all the very dry, very hot areas of the world, and we would see kind of vegetation that looks like that. Very sparse, plants are adapted to that kind of climate. If we were to go to very hot and wet areas of the world, the tropical rainforests, again, we would see this vegetation with similar adaptations, and it looks very similar. Now, what's behind all this, of course, is climate, which is driving these patterns. And so specifically the patterns that we see in temperature and rainfall or precipitation. So one grouping of biome are the Mediterranean climate regions, although there is some dispute, some argument about whether this actually exists. But the Mediterranean climate regions include, we're sitting in one right now, California, Chile, South Africa, Southwest Australia, and of course its namesake, the Mediterranean region. And overall, if we were to group all this, the land area shaded here, we'd find that it makes up about 5% of the total land surface on Earth. And the climate is characterized by cool, wet winters and long, hot, dry summers. And one thing you may notice, is that they kind of occur in a line, right? They all occur along the same latitude. They are found between 30 and 45 degrees in latitude. Another characteristic is that they're all found on the southwest edges of continents. So pretty nice locations, right? Having the coast right there. And so they have the coast on one side, and usually they're abutted by a desert region to one side or another. And if we were to take a little trip to all these locations, if you're planning on doing that, please invite me. You would see very similar vegetation in these different locations. And so here are just pictures of vegetation from all these Mediterranean climates. You see, it looks very similar. The plants there have very similar adaptations to this kind of climate. And one other, I'm going to drop a little foreshadowing right now. Another characteristic is that fire is a common disturbance in these kinds of habitats as well. Now, if we were to look at the aquatic habitats of these regions, so the Mediterranean temporary ponds, we see they look very different, right? Probably the one thing they have in common is they're all filled with water, but they look very different. A lot of these have very different geology underpinning the aquatic habitat. But if you actually go in and sample these pools, you find that they're incredibly similar, both in their animal life and their plant life. So up here above is a theory created this composite animal community showing the typical animals found in these Mediterranean temporary ponds. Down below, I have examples of plants that are found in the genus Ranunculus, which is the poppy family. And these are an aquatic plant, and you find these in many parts of the world in these kinds of habitats also. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. These seasonal wetlands have a number of important functions in the landscape. They're important for flood control. They're important for water quality of the region. And in fact, going back thousands of years, people have been connected to these temporary, these seasonal wetlands. And many times, well, there's archaeological evidence going back many thousands of years of humans using this for water sources and also developing agriculture around habitats like this. And that's still true today. You still have people throughout the world that use these as water. They're important for processing nutrients. They're important for wildlife habitat, especially birds and migrating birds specifically. And they're also important for biodiversity. They're species found nowhere else are found in these kinds of ecosystems. And finally, there's a social aspect, which I alluded to earlier with these seasonal wetlands. They're also, people enjoy them for, social reasons, recreation, and so on. They also, and this is here in California and throughout the world, these seasonal wetlands have many threats, and the primary threat is habitat loss. These kinds of habitats are found in open areas that are flat and which are perfect locations to develop urban areas, to develop agricultural, for agricultural development. And so that's the primary threat to these kinds of ecosystems. But there's other ones, including draining and infilling, which is just another form of habitat loss. Also, invasive species are a great threat. In some parts of the world, overgrazing is degrading this habitat. And finally, pollutants in the form of nutrient pollutants from fertilizers, as well as other pollutants such as pesticides. And just to highlight and illustrate that habitat loss issue, I have a couple of figures here for us to contemplate. So up here, we have, of course, California, and we have land cover in the Central Valley here, showing the grassland habitat in yellow, but most of that green and blue up there are wetlands and aquatic habitats. So this is pre-1900 Central Valley. And about a century later, you see most of that being gone. And so, for example, in the habitat I work in, the California vernal pools, it's estimated that less than 10% of that habitat still remains. This lower set of photos is from Zimbabwe, and this is from around the year 2000. And this whole central area here are seasonal wetlands surrounded by a city. And then off to the right is that same area about a decade later. And it may be difficult to see, but we have all urban development within that wetland area. So it highlights this great threat to these habitats. So I next want to dig a little bit deeper into the ecology of seasonal wetlands. And in the following slides, I'm going to use the California vernal pools to illustrate these general patterns. And so I first want to point out that these habitats are very common in the landscape. We tend to overlook these ecosystems because they're always changing, but they're very common. And to illustrate this point, I have this map from a recent paper. And for most of the world, including the US, very few seasonal wetlands are mapped. And when we do, we end up seeing that there's incredibly high densities of these very small ecosystems throughout the landscape. And so over here in A, of course, that's Northern California. And you can see this inset over here, this map, and all those dots represent seasonal wetlands. And you can see that across the US that these small water bodies really are littered throughout the landscape. Incredibly high densities. And I just want to point out high densities, especially compared to like big permanent water bodies. The other aspect of these systems that are really important for their ecology is this flooding drought dynamic that I've been talking about. And we call the period of time that they are filled up, that's called the hydro period. And for most of these systems, that hydro period is really what is determining which animals and which plants are found in the ecosystem. Last year, I read this book by Hernan Diaz, In the Distance, and there was this great quote that just blew my mind. And I thought, man, he must be talking about vernal pools with this. And so the line is, nothing in nature is ever final. All ends are ephemeral because they are pregnant with new beginnings. It's an awesome line. And it really summarizes these systems precisely. And it may be, kind of a nice little philosophy to take home as well. And so what this is pertaining to is this cycle of filling up and drying out. And here in the California vernal pools, of course, during wintertime, that's when we get our rainfall, a cool, wet winter. And so for vernal pools, they have this hard pan layer underneath the soil. And as it starts to rain, the water table builds up, and once it breaks the surface, that's where you get a vernal pool. I'm not going to go into all the details about that, but and so during the wintertime, they're filled up in these ponds, and as we head into spring, of course, it gets warmer, there's less rainfall, and these pools evaporate, and here's that line again, right, with the whoops, what did I just do? With the ends are pregnant with new beginnings. Well, they dry out, and they're replaced by these incredible showy wildflowers, right, that vernal pools are well known for. And that is a short period of time. Most of the year, it looks like this. And so you can imagine that if it's looking like this most of the year, most people will think, this is just worthless habitat. Now, finally, another kind of characteristic that unites these seasonal wetlands is that they have disproportionate levels of biodiversity. So we're talking about the numbers of different kinds of species found in the community. So they have very high biodiversity, and then they also have high levels of endemism. And endemism is referring to species that are only found in that community. And Mediterranean regions themselves are considered hotspots, but they have disproportionate numbers of species according to its size. So for example, Freshwater ecosystems cover less than 1% of the Earth, but they support about 6% of all known species. Another crazy statistic is in France, temporary ponds make up about 0.05%. So this is half of a tenth of a percent of the area in France, but support 35% of the rare species and 5% of the protected plants. So getting back to this idea that they're hotspots, this is an idea that's been around for a couple of decades. We have these biodiversity hotspots, and what determines these locations is that they have very high endemism, right? So species only found in that area, and also high habitat loss. And if you look at this map of the world, in red are all the biodiversity hotspots of the world, and they're mostly here in the tropical regions of the world, but also the Mediterranean regions. Every single location is also a biodiversity hotspot. Pretty cool. And here in California, we have an incredible number of endemic species found in the vernal pools, over 60 endemic plants and invertebrates. Here we have a picture of the longhorn fairy shrimp. And many of these species are endangered or threatened, and we're talking about aquatic invertebrates like fairy shrimp, as well as vertebrates and terrestrial plants. Here's a little mosaic of the cutie pies of the vernal pools, and some of my favorites. And we have fairy shrimp and clam shrimp and tadpole shrimp and some of the insects like dragonfly nymphs and frogs and tiger salamanders, and then some of the really great wildflowers that vernal pools are well known for. Tricolored monkey flower, and one of my favorites, that orange stringy stuff up there, that's a parasitic plant. So it's a plant that produces no chlorophyll, doesn't do any photosynthesis. It digs these modified roots into other plants and sucks the life out of them. They're awesome. And that species, believe me, and they're only found, that particular species is found in vernal pools. So one of the questions I get, and this occurred quite a bit when we were going through that series of droughts a few years ago, is how are the vernal pools doing? How are the animals and plants doing with the drought and stuff? And you have to remember, these organisms, we're talking the aquatic and the terrestrial, the plants and the animals, they've evolved under this incredibly variable environment. Anybody who's lived in California for a few years knows you never know what the rainfall pattern is going to be like, right? We may get a lot of rain, we may get a little rain. It may come in December, it may come in October, it may not come until March. And so these are the conditions that these species have evolved under. And so I want to talk a little bit about the ecology of these species, and getting to this very common question I get is, how do they survive? How do these animals and plants survive the dry, wet habitat? So how I describe it is that there's really two types we can categorize them to. There's the time travelers, and then there's the space travelers, all right? So let's talk about the time travelers first. So these are these aquatic animals found in the system that produce these rusting eggs. And these rusting eggs are resistant-shelled, dormant embryos. And you can see this egg sac of this female longhorn fairy shrimp right there. And these close-up pictures, you can see these incredible, elaborate surfaces that these resting eggs have. But they're incredibly resistant to conditions, and they require certain environmental cues for them to break that dormancy. And some work in my lab has shown that factors such as light and nutrient conditions can influence the breaking of dormancy. So we've shown that light improves dormancy, initiates dormancy, and low nutrients also in the water. And the cool thing is that some of these resting eggs hatch immediately, so the following year, and then others can just sit in the soil for years, decades, before they hatch. And in fact, there's this whole area of ecology called resurrection ecology that looks at the ecology and evolution of this dormancy. And they've hatched decades-old resting eggs, even ones that have been over 100 years old. It's pretty amazing. The other cool thing about these, and so a lot of these include the crustaceans found in the aquatic habitat, so fairy shrimp and tadpole shrimp and water fleas, copepods, and whatnot. And a number of these iconic vernal pool species are found in the group Brachiopoda, and they're described as living fossils. And they're described as living fossils because they're morphologically, today, very similar to what we see in fossils 200 to 300 million years old. And so these are the fairy shrimp and the tadpole shrimp, clam shrimp are all common to vernal pools, as well as water fleas. The water fleas are found kind of all over. And kind of the other interesting tidbit about this is that these animals were, up until about 200 million years ago, found in every single aquatic habitat on this planet. And after that, they were pretty much restricted from most of those habitats. And today, we really only find these in temporary water bodies. And the reasoning is, or it's thought that that period of about 200 million years ago coincides with the diversification of fish. And so it's thought that fish diversified, entered all these various aquatic habitats, and eliminated these groups from those aquatic habitats. And that's why we only find them in these temporary systems now, because fish can't live there. And so I have just some video of fairy shrimp. Here's just some fairy shrimp we've caught
its name.
From one of our pools.
That's what gives them.
And just to get you an idea of how they look once we sample them. And then here's a tadpole shrimp. And both of these are endangered species that I've been showing. And over here down to the left is another endemic of vernal pools, which are the clam shrimp, Zizicus californicus. Okay, so those are the time travelers. So they kind of survive that drought in as those resting eggs. Then we also have the space travelers. And these are animals that are only found in vernal pools, these seasonal wetlands, during the wet phase only. And so if they're adults, and these tend to be the insects of the vernal pools. And these tend to be insects, and so if they're adults dispersing from permanent water bodies, they can disperse in and out of these seasonal wetlands. So they're space travelers. For some of these insects, the insects lay their eggs in these water bodies, and it's the larvae that develop and hatch out and as adults before drought occurs. And so the ones that disperse in and out can be things like predaceous diving beetles and back swimmers. And ones that lay their eggs are things like mosquitoes and chironomids that then develop in the water body and escape as adults before the pools dry up. Now, plants are freaks. Let's face it, and where do I start? They're kind of time travelers, right? They have seeds. And those seeds can sit in the soil for many, many years and do just fine. And so they're kind of time travelers. But then many of these plants kind of bridge this aquatic and terrestrial life. And they have all these adaptations to the aquatic and the terrestrial phases of vernal pools and these seasonal wetlands. So for example, a lot of them have these adaptations to the timing of when they germinate. So some germinate very early as soon as they fill up. Some wait until much later on before they germinate. Another adaptation that plants have is that they leaf shape. So some produce two types of leaves. One leaf for kind of when it's filled up with water, and then another kind of leaf when it's dry. And so they're both, these different leaf types are adapted to kind of the dry and wet conditions. And then you have a number of plants that have these hollow leaves and hollow stems that allow oxygen to get down to the roots when these pools are filled. And they have a number of other kind of physiological adaptations to deal with being in these flooded areas and being in these dry areas. So the kind of research that I'm interested in these seasonal wetlands and vernal pools and specifically, and rock pools, as Enid pointed out, mostly focus on biodiversity and how environmental variation and disturbances and stuff affect biodiversity and the functioning of these ecosystems. And we cover a lot of ground in my lab. I'm interested in spatial ecology, how biodiversity changes in space and how things like dispersal and movement among communities influences biodiversity patterns. I'm interested in climate change issues, temperature. How does temperature and things like erratic rainfall affect these kinds of communities? Also, we address questions like food webs, eutrophication, so nutrient pollution, species invasions, and in general, how different kinds of disturbances affect the community. And I have this mosaic of a bunch of students off here to the right to, I don't need to be reminded, but remind me to tell you that I couldn't have done any of this stuff without all the awesome students that I've been able to work with here at Sac State. Some incredible, awesome students. Yeah. Now, my approach to these communities is diverse. I approach them by looking at, by using data mining approaches, but also mostly we do projects in the laboratory. I also do projects in these basically I call them buckets, but the fancy word is mesocosms. And so this is here right on campus, and this allows us to do experimental work you wouldn't normally be able to do out in these vernal pools. And I also do a great deal of field work, so doing work in natural vernal pools. I'm going to talk mostly about vernal pools, but I was trying to figure out where do I fit this in, because this is another ecosystem I work in, and it's probably my favorite. This is my favorite ecosystem I've ever worked in. Well, I wouldn't say ever, but close. And these are rock pools. And if you go down to the Altamont Pass, so we're talking Alameda, Contra Costa Valley, Contra Costa counties, you'll see these hilly areas, grassland, but they have these monstrous rock outcroppings, some the size of buildings. And if you scurry up to the top, they have these small depressions that fill up with water, as you can see here and here. Some are small and some are just like, you could do laps in them if you wanted. And what emerges once they fill up with water is pretty much the same species you find in vernal pools. A lot of these endangered fairy shrimp and California tiger salamanders and so on. And this has been an ongoing project for about 8 or 9 years that I've had with Dr. Doug Bell, who's at the East Bay Regional Park District. And we've been collaborating on a great deal of work looking at these communities and ecosystems. And recently with him and some other biologists, We got funding from U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Bureau of Reclamation to look at the ecology of this very rare species, this longhorn fairy shrimp, which only occurs in a handful of populations throughout California. It's found here in these rock pools, and then you find the next population you find down in Merced, and then the next population after that is over in San Luis Obispo County, the Carrizo Plain. So it has this very patchy, it's a very rare species, and we're trying to understand the ecology of the species. But what I'm going to be talking about mostly this evening, what's left of it, is some of the work I did as part of this last year where I was, I got this Fulbright Award that took me to Israel, and then I also got received a regional travel grant that allowed me to start also collaborations in Morocco. And so I was doing research there, and I also taught a class, and it was by far just an amazing experience. And I want to just introduce just the collaborators. Specifically, there's more collaborators, but the ones that I collaborated with on the research I'm talking about tonight, Leon Blaustein, and professor at University of Haifa, and his graduate student, Lital Ozeri. There she is, and there's Leon. Laila Razi, professor at the University of Mohammed V in Rabat, Morocco, and her graduate student, he's almost done with his PhD, Mohamed El Madihi. And then a number of people from Belgium and France, Patrick Guias from France, and Luc Brendonck, and Martin Vandenbroek from Belgium. And also, once again, of course, couldn't have done any of this stuff without the great Sac State students. So here are these three locations, California, Israel, and Morocco. They occur very similar latitude, and you can see that they all have a very similar climate. If you go to the northern part of each of these locations, it's kind of cooler and wet, and as you head to the south, you get these desert regions. So very similar, very different in size. And so how similar are these locations? Well, it was crazy going and sampling these seasonal wetlands in Morocco and Israel, because I would scoop up the critters, and it would pretty much be where I would find the same kinds of critters I would find everywhere else. And it was really cool. And the plants were very similar. It was some in the same genus. And so here are just pictures of Israel, Morocco, and California, the vernal pool seasonal wetlands. And then here are the tadpole shrimp found in these different locations. And then they all have their own salamanders. So we have, here in California, we have the California tiger salamander. In Morocco, you have the African fire salamander. And in Israel, you have the Near Eastern fire salamander. Very cool critters. A few years ago, I did a project where I looked at animals across that whole latitudinal gradient, so from that hot, dry area up to the cool, wet. And with the animals in vernal pools, we see that overall biodiversity increases when you go from south to north. The folks in Morocco did a similar study, but with plants, and they found a similar pattern that when you go from hot, dry to the cool, wet, you get an increase in biodiversity of the plants. And so we get these very similar patterns in these seasonal wetlands, and we're starting to do some parallel studies that kind of use this as a foundation to do some comparisons between Morocco and California. And this is in collaboration with some other biologists here in California. So this is ongoing work. Also in these different locations, and this is true throughout all the Mediterranean regions, they have very similar land usage. And so, for example, we have California and Morocco, and you see it's dominated by agricultural and livestock use here in the central parts of the valley. And throughout Morocco. And And here in California, a graduate student of mine a number of years ago, Russell Crowe, and I did a project where we looked at cattle waste addition into these vernal pool communities. And we found that as you add more cattle waste, you get this decline in plant species diversity. And we did a parallel study in Morocco looking at cattle waste, there it is highlighted, and also trampling. And both of those disturbances found similar pattern where we found a decline in plant richness and animal richness in these communities. And up here, this is here in California, and this is a shot from Morocco. It's kind of unusual because we mostly saw like goats and sheep, but here on this day, there were cattle congregating in the seasonal wetland. Now, fire, as I mentioned earlier, is an important disturbance in the Mediterranean regions of the world. And I don't need to tell you that, right, from this past summer with all the fires in the news here in California. And similarly, in Israel, you have these common fires throughout. And in all of these locations, fire retardants are used to suppress fires. And so there's been quite a bit of work done in the U.S. on the effects of fire retardants on terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. But there's still a lot that is not known about the overall effects of fire retardants on these organisms in these seasonal wetlands. And so a project we did in Israel looked at increasing fire retardant effects on the organisms found in their temporary ponds. And for example, with the fire salamander, we found that as you increase fire retardant addition into the communities, you get a decline in the survival. So less is surviving as you add more fire retardants. And this was at the general range of what you find applied in that region. And interestingly, we looked at the whole community, and I'm just going to show you the effects on mosquitoes. And with mosquitoes, we see a very different effect, that with adding those fire retardants, we get more and more eggs being laid into those habitats with fire retardant addition. Now, I want to point out that in both the cattle waste projects and in the fire retardant projects, we're not concluding, don't graze and don't use fire retardants. But I think we're just trying to illustrate that these activities have effects on the environment, and we're trying to kind of document what those effects are. And it's really up to us as people to kind of evaluate how and when and where do we use different levels of grazing and fire retardants and so on. Okay, just to summarize this talk, I wanted to point out that first, I want you to take home this idea that these wetlands found throughout the world in these Mediterranean regions and beyond are very similar, and both in the kinds of species we find there, also the functions that they provide, the landscape, as well as the threats that are being met. And still, there's been a great deal of research being done on these seasonal wetlands throughout the world, but they're still very understudied. They're still underappreciated habitat here and throughout the world, and still having those great threats due to habitat loss. And one of the things I've been thinking about over the past few years is kind of this global view of these wetlands and trying to kind of make bridges with these other locations and think about generalizations. Are there generalizations that we can make about the ecology and the conservation and management of these kinds of ecosystems? And true, that's going to be difficult because you have different politics and different cultures in these different areas, but it's something I've been thinking about a great deal. And so as I think about this, it's kind of, you remember the old bumper sticker, the think globally, act locally, kind of thinking globally and doing research locally, but trying to make those connections. And tonight I've been talking about these small ecosystems that are found in this really small part of the world in the big scheme of things. But you have to remember that these ecosystems are part of something bigger. That these ecosystems are kind of the landscape. These are part of these ecosystems that we as people depend on, and our well-being depends on healthy ecosystems, the clean air, the clean water, healthy soils, the organisms that provide many of the services, and just the fact that we get to share this planet with these organisms that are here present day, but we have this 3.5 billion year lineage of life on this planet, and which is very humbling. And of course, there's also many problems that are being met in these ecosystems. Of course, climate change and habitat loss and so on. And these kinds of issues really need addressing. And I'm a researcher, but I'm also an educator, and I hope that you take away from this talk a little piece of these kinds of ecosystems and keep it in the back of your mind, and hopefully, it translates into action with whether it's, voting this fall and in the future for you young people, and actually everybody, or voting with your wallet or supporting groups. And there's some awesome education groups here, like Splash, that supports education, and awesome group. You can always support them, too, and which focus on vernal pools and educating school groups in that regard. And so I want to leave you with this quote from one of my favorite authors, Hermann Hesse. And this is from Siddhartha. And they both listened silently to the water, which to them was not just water, but the voice of life, the voice of being, the voice of perpetual becoming. And so I hope that you are able to experience these temporary ponds, seasonal wetlands, whatever you want to call them, and become an advocate for them, and go out and appreciate them. Get outside. And if we have time, I'd be happy to take questions. And here I'll leave you with this picture from a temporary pond in the Middle Atlas of Morocco. This is a high elevation pond. It was partly frozen with a sunset in the background. And thanks for listening. Thanks for being here. Uh-oh, I'm going to get stumped.
So you probably know what I'm going to ask.
I have no idea.
In
I couldn't possibly guess.
In California, our vernal pools were tended sustainably for thousands of years by indigenous Californians using fire.
Yeah.
And in the Mideast, there's a parallel system that Gary Nabhan has studied with water systems called wadis and alhima to protect them. And I wonder if in Israel and in Morocco, if there isn't also sort of an indigenous cultural relationship of tending these systems. Did you talk about that at all?
No, not in the traditional sense, right? They're all modern countries, and they all have the same issues with habitat loss. But I will point out that as I was going throughout Morocco, they would point out there were some pools that were regularly burned. So that was really the most interesting interaction between people and seasonal wetlands was in Morocco. They, in many of these areas, would not develop it. They would plant and do agriculture right up to the edge, but once they dried. And they wouldn't actually farm in the actual pool basin itself. And they did regularly burn in some of these areas, especially in the agricultural regions. And whether that is something that goes back, however indigenous times, I don't know. But I did see a lot of burning of vernal pools, and they were really nice ones too. Yeah. And I was just out at Mather, and that's been burned a couple times. There's a great opportunity to explore some of those activities here in California too.
You had a slide up there, seasonal wetland. I think the third word was functions. You said important for processing nutrients. Can you give some examples?
Yeah, so in some cases, these seasonal wetlands, you find runoff from agricultural areas, and you get the processing by the microbes in the wetlands that will many times take care of those nutrients. Uh-oh.
Hey, I was curious about your graph showing the mosquito abundances with the fire retardant, and wondering if you can comment on why the increases with the fire retardant.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, great question. So the fire retardants have lots of nutrients in them. They have nitrogen and phosphorus in them, along with some metals and other chemicals. And it's those nutrients that we've been finding. They create. You have this nutrient pulse that increases the bacteria and increases the algae, and the mosquitoes then are attracted to that, we think. And so they tend to lay their eggs in those kinds of habitats. And then and it gets a little bit complex with the fire salamander though, because they have lowered survival. They also it also affects their feeding behavior as well. And we're not really sure. We have data on the whole community, from the bacteria to the fire salamanders and everything in between. So we're starting to explore the whys. So why, W-H-Y, not the whys, but the why of those were happening, the survival decreasing and the mosquitoes increasing. But I believe with the mosquitoes, it's that nutrient pulse that increases resources. Yeah. Hey, Hallie.
My question is about urbanization. You showed a satellite image of time lapse of wetlands before urbanization, and then after, some decades later, being filled in by cities. And I'm wondering if there's any interest or any efforts going on to restore riparian, vernal pool, wetland environments within an urban area to retrace some of these vernal pools.
So there?
Well, not necessarily there, but maybe even here or anywhere in the world that you know of.
Not that I know of. I mean, you have little remnants of vernal pools surrounded by urban areas. I mean, on some level, Mather Field, and you have Phoenix Field, of course, and other little patches. But as far as restoring them in the middle of an urban area, that would be cool. But we don't even really know how that isolation affects these vernal pools. And so I think before, at least here, we start jumping into, okay, let's create some vernal pools in the middle of this area, we need to better understand the implications of that, right? That implications of isolating vernal pools. And that photo particular sequence was from Zimbabwe, and I don't think they're doing anything to restore the pools there. But that's an interesting question, interesting thought.
You may not have studied the data yet, but you mentioned that you have data for all the species in the pools in your fire retardant study.
Oh, uh-huh.
And I'm curious as to whether you know whether the other zooplankton macroinvertebrate numbers have decreased, so that there's the potential that also mosquitoes could be
Yeah.
ovipositing at greater numbers in those ponds.
Yeah. Yeah, so it may, yeah, so I think what you're getting at is that fire, it may be that fire retardants are suppressing all the animals there to begin with, and so now the mosquitoes don't have that competition. So that's a certain possibility, and we do have that data, and offhand I do not remember, because it gets complicated too, because you also have other predators in there. But yeah, that's something we're looking at. Really the first paper that's coming out of that project is focused on mosquitoes. And then we're going to take it to the whole community, all the food webs, including the zooplankton and the other insects, as well as the fire salamanders. It gets complicated because you have the effects of the fire retardant, but then you have species competing, you have predators eating certain species, and so teasing all that stuff apart is gonna take us a little while, statistically, but that's our end goal, is to get at those details. And the other thing is, I want to, with all the fires happening here, I was thinking it'd be great to get a hold of some of the fire retardants we're using here and kind of replicate the study using California vernal pool organisms. So hopefully that's something I've been thinking about lately, and I'd like to pursue as well.
We have time for this question and one more.
Okay.
Jamie, do you get any problems from homocentric people in mosquito abatement districts about vernal pools at Phoenix Field and Mather and so on? It's nice to have a seasonal wetland, but you have Nile virus and other things.
Yeah, nobody's talked to me. Nobody talks to me. Nobody wants to talk to me. You want to talk to me. No, so nobody's talked to me about that. But, some of my research has found, and this is using those mesocosms, and actually some field work too. What I find is, and it's getting back to your question, that I tend to find mosquitoes in vernal pools, talking about natural ones or our buckets, when they fill up late in the season. So you get a March, like February or March filling of the vernal pool. And at that time, a lot of the those time travelers that are emerging from the soil are not emerging. And that's where you get most of the mosquitoes. So I find that pattern when you get that late filling, but also when you have also a lot of nutrients in the pool too, you get mosquitoes. And so that may be what's happening out at Phoenix Field. And I haven't been out there in a while, but it'd be great to kind of look at that also. That they're really what? Oh, polluted, yeah.
Okay, last question.
I'll have to go check that out.
You mentioned Splash. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, Splash is an maybe you guys go. So Splash is this educational program out in Mather, and they have a visitor center there with animals and plants, and it's been going on for like decades. This program where they bring in school groups and take them out in the vernal pools and kind of talk about natural history of vernal pools, and they get a chance to interact with the organisms, and then they do activities in the visitor center. And so I can give you more information about Splash. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So they also do wildflower walks. Oh, okay. So here's the man to talk to. But they do wildflower walks and and it's an awesome program. Yeah, so you can go check out, if you just type Google, of course, Google Sac Splash, you'll get their website. And they have a great website with great natural history about the vernal pools and whatnot. And if you ever want to visit, my students and I do projects out there at Mather Field and elsewhere. And so if you want to tag along and help out, volunteer, we can always use an extra hand and romp through the mud.
Thank you, Dr.
So,
Kneitel.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.